Hello and welcome to today's Finsweet Plus session on building SEO-friendly WWX apps. My name is Ruairi McNicholas. I'm a WWX developer here at Finsweet, and we're going to look at how we can add user-generated content to the Webflow CMS with little help from Xano to ensure all our content is SEO-friendly.
Sweet.
We're gonna dive in here discussing SEO-friendly WWX apps. And with this particular stack, there can sometimes be challenges with how SEO-friendly your web app is. So we're going to look at two terms here, our two important pieces of terminology today: server-side rendering and client-side rendering. You might be familiar with these, you might not. So we'll quickly go through them here. When you visit a website on your browser, the website's living on a server somewhere, and the server is going to send the website over to your browser, and your browser turns it from code into the website that you get to see visually. With server-side rendering, all the HTML is rendered or created on the web server, and it's sent over to the client's browser. So we'll look at an example of WWX app here. This is a free mental health training course that people can sign up to do. And this page here is entirely server-side rendered. All of this content comes from Webflow in one chunk, and it gets pushed into the user's browser. And that is the most optimal for SEO. On the other side, we have client-side rendering. And this is where the server is still sending over HTML document that has some JavaScript that's sent as well. And that JavaScript code, in the case of rendering, is fetching data from somewhere, and it's populating the DOM or the HTML page with this dynamic content. So when you're using Wized and you're pulling in data, it could be from Airtable, Supabase, Xano. That data lives outside of your main server where Webflow lives. And what Wized is doing is it's running JavaScript, it's making a request, it's pulling in data, and then displaying it on the page. So if you've used Wized, you'll have probably seen the render list action. And that is an example of client-side rendering. The issue is that search engines much prefer server-side rendering. And the reason for that is, for the client-side rendering, when Google has a bot crawling your website, it has to wait for the JavaScript to execute, and then it has to scan the content. So we'll leave a link in this video to this page on Google Search Console, which basically talks about this here. So JavaScript loads additional content. This is called client-side rendering. But as it says, there are limitations for JavaScript in Google Search, and other search engines may choose to ignore JavaScript and won't see JavaScript generated content. My understanding of Google at the minute is it can get the content, but it's slower, it takes longer, it doesn't update as quickly as server-side rendering. So that's the challenge that we have to deal with here. So if we go back over to this website, this is all server-side rendered. This content here with the loader is client-side rendered. So let me just refresh that. It should be showing a list of courses, being a little bit slow. There we go. Okay. Now it's generally a lot quicker than that, but we'll park that for a minute. This content here comes from Xano. So everything else that you see here on the page is coming from Webflow. And Wized goes to Xano and it says, hey, I want you to pull in a list of all the lessons and render them in here. In this particular instance, this isn't an issue because this content is gated. Gated meaning you have to log in to access this content. So if I try to access this in an incognito browser, it is going to redirect me back to the login. So in this example, this page is not important to SEO. This page doesn't get indexed. We don't need it to come up in Google. We pretty much just need the home page to come up in Google, and the home page does not have any client-side rendered content. But you will, at some point, have to work on a web app where SEO is important, and you do have to pull in the content conditionally. So what we're going to look at is how we can get around that and we can make that content SEO friendly. So the solution we're going to look at, there's a couple of ways of doing it. The one we're going to look at here is another website. It is the client first certification. This isn't finished yet. It isn't launched. When it is, we'll do another session covering how this works. For now, we're just going to look at how we made this SEO friendly. So when you get your certification and your client certified, you will be able to appear in our directory, which is here. And this directory is public facing. It's not gated. So we want this to be SEO friendly. Now we could build this and we could just pull in all the information from Xano, but that's client side rendering. To server side render it, we need to get this information into the Webflow CMS. And we're going to look at how to do that. So we have a form here where you pass the certification and you get to upload your profile and get it listed as a verified expert. And what this does is users go down and they fill out their information, and then they click Save Changes down here. Or if it's their first time creating it, it'll say Publish Changes. And what happens then is there is a very simple request in Wized that is just going to go into each of those form fields and send that information off to Xano. So that's pretty straightforward so far. Over in Xano, we have a database that is going to store all of that information about the user. So let's just say if I update my name to Red King is the literal translation of my native name. So I'm going to put that in there and save changes. And over here, if that worked properly, we will see the name change like so. So if you wanted, as I said, you could just pull all this information in, but we want to get this into the Webflow CMS. So once the information goes in here, we are running a function that is going to send that data to the Webflow CMS. So if you haven't worked with it before, Webflow has an API that lets you interact with and change your Webflow site using an API. So you can get a list of your sites, you can get a list of pages on the site, you can get a list of forms, so on and so forth. What we're interested in is the CMS. We want to be able to create a collection item based on the user's info in Xano. And when they come back to update it, we want to be able to update that collection item. And these two things are going to let us programmatically create content on the Webflow CMS. So the very basic overview of how this works is somebody fills out this form, Wized sends the data over to Xano. Xano makes an API call and it sends off that information to our Webflow site. And over on Webflow, that item then gets created as a CMS item, which is here. And if we reload this, we should see that my name has changed to Red King, if I have it working correctly. Oh, it may have actually made another one. It did. So still some debugging to do here, but what should have happened there is this would now say Red King. All of this other information that you see here, this all came from Xano. And now that it's in here, it is SEO-friendly content. This is going to show up with no client-side rendering involved. And for this web app, that's a very big benefit because we want this certified directory to be useful. We want people that want Webflow sites built to be able to find certified client first certified freelancers here. So the SEO is very important. And once that's created in there, again, the user will be able to update it. We also have some other features here. If they untick publish profile, it will unpublish this. So if they want to temporarily take themselves down, they can do that. And they can even change their availability. So if I actually click into my profile here, this is all coming from the Webflow CMS. So this is just your usual Webflow CMS template, pulling in the information from the CMS, but that information first went into the CMS from Xano. So that's the overview. So let's take a look a little further at how we would go about setting this up. If I had just created this site and I wanted to start sending the content from Xano to Webflow, the first thing I would do is I would create an endpoint in Xano all the way down the bottom here. That's called Webflow Experts. And what this does, very simple, this just pulls in a list of all the content that's currently on the CMS. And it's not doing anything with it. It's not storing it anywhere. It's just for me to look at it. And the reason for that is we need to see how the data looks when it comes from the API before we can figure out how to send it back. So we have an API request here. And just for people that are a little new to Xano, what we would do is we would add a new function here and we would type in external API request. And anytime you need to go to an API, be it on Webflow or any other service that has an API you can use, you would be clicking this and adding that into the function stack. Just delete that. And what we need to do is we first need to find the API that we are going to hit. And we'll go over to the Webflow API and we will go list collection items. And I see there's a little notification from Webflow down here saying they're having infrastructure issues. So hopefully we can actually view the API documentation. It's not showing here, so that's not a good sign. Hello, Rory here from the future. During this live session, the Webflow docs stopped working, just full on couldn't be loaded. So now that they're back up and running, recording this short snippet just to show you how to use these docs because there's some handy tools here. So for our particular use case here, we needed some IDs. We needed to get the ID of our CMS collection that we wanted to add CMS posts to. You can't see that inside of Webflow. So what you would do is go to developers.webflow.com and make sure you're in the data API v2 up here. And you would start by getting a list of your sites. So on the docs, you can test out the documentation over here on the right-hand side. So what you would do is, first of all, the language that we want here is shell, or what's called a curl request. That's what Xano uses for external API requests. And you would click authenticate here to give the Webflow docs permission to go into your Webflow sites and to pull information from them. And you'd start off by just, first of all, listing your sites. You can just run this in here and find the site you want, copy its ID. Next, down to CMS collections, list collections, and you would put your site ID into this box. And then that's going to return your collections and their IDs. Then find the collection you want, get its ID, and then when we are handling items, when we are creating a collection item, that ID is going to go in here. Lastly, there's a handy copy feature down here. So when you're setting this up, you want to create a new item in Webflow, you will authenticate here. You will be getting a API token from your Webflow site, which you'll put in there. So let's just say that was, 2222. It won't be. It'll be something a lot longer. And let's just say again, for simplicity's sake, that your collection ID was 2222. And there's a little helpful builder here that will help you to build out this request. So, let's say there was a field called email. You could put a couple of these in here. Let's say location. And Webflow's documentation is actually going to build out your request over here. And you can either test it out here, and when it's ready, just click this copy symbol and go over to Xano. And when you are adding to your function stack and you are creating an external API request, there is an option up here, import curl. This is very, very useful. Make sure to take a look at it and see how it works. If I didn't use this, I would have to manually set all of these fields based on this information, or I can copy, I can import curl, and it is going to set it up for me. It is going to put my collection ID in here. It is going to set the method, and it's going to help me see how this needs to be structured. And then I can go and add to it as I need to. So that's the Webflow API docs. Very useful. Back into the recording of the main session. So if we run this, we are going to get back a list of all the people in that CMS. Thankfully, this part is still working. It's just the documentation that is down. So here I am. Here is my content from Webflow. So this content here, we are seeing over here. So this shows us how the data is formatted and what the fields are. So for example, when we're sending this information, we can't just put in work email in all caps. That's not how Webflow wants to receive it. By pulling this information down, we can see how it wants us to send it over, lowercase with hyphens. One thing to be aware of is some content doesn't come across as text. So work email, that's fine. Expert since, website URL, until we get down to this expert type. We have agency, freelancer, and studio. And it's just the way the Webflow API is set up. The way it handles those in the back end is it gives those a unique ID. So again, when we're adding a user from our API, we can't just put in freelancer. We have to put in this ID. So when I was building this, what I did was I just opened up like a sticky note on my Mac. So what I had to do is I had to work out what the ID for each of these was. So I went over and saw that I'm a freelancer. That means that this code is for freelancer. Then I had to go and change it to studio, save it, rerun this, and then get the ID for that. And that way you just have to do a bit of kind of research to work out what those IDs are. So that's the first step. We look at how this data is stored in Webflow. Once we're armed with that, we can then set up sending that information over to Webflow. So again, I have another API endpoint down here, and it is called update profile. So there's some complicated stuff going on here. We'll do the very simple part first. We have a call to Webflow down here, an API request that is going to send the user's information. So when they fill out the form, all of that content gets sent into Xano, the profile short description, long description, contact email, website link, all of that stuff. And we then need to set up an external API request to send that data off to Webflow. So again, you would go on to the Webflow docs when they're back up, and it would tell you, hey, if you want to send information, you need to use this link, and you once again need to enter the ID of your overall CMS collection. And last time we used get down here to get a list of those. Back in here. This time we're using post. So get is to get a list of them. Post is going to create a new one. And we're basically then just setting all of this field data. So work email. Again, remember when we pulled in that list, we saw that that's how that field was referenced. So we want to say to Webflow, in my CMS item for work email, I want you to populate that with this, the user's contact email. Are they available for work or not? We want that come from the user, the information that they submitted. The reason it's not coming from the inputs is we take the inputs, we update the user with those inputs, and then pull them from there, so that we first store the info in Xano and then put it into Webflow. So it's pretty much just a matter of going down and mapping all of your inputs in Xano to the fields in Webflow. Now it's a bit of work. The more fields you have in Webflow, the longer this is going to take. But you basically just need to go down through it and account for each of those. The profile summary, the city, the name, their certificate ID, their country that they're from. And you basically just set this up, go down through them all. And again, similar thing down here, we need to send our API key to Webflow. And that is, I don't want to say that's it, but that's basically how this works. You need to get the API key, you need to specify your ID, and you then just need to plug in all this information. And if that comes back as successful, it gets added in Webflow. We'll quickly just take a look at why this is so complicated. So if we look at this part down here, when we create a new item in the Webflow CMS, it comes with an ID. So at the end of this request, we update the user and we say, hey, that ID that came back from Webflow, I want to store that for that user in the database. This will start off empty, and the first time we submit our item to the Webflow CMS, it's going to send back this ID. So every time that this runs, we are doing a conditional check here. We're saying if that field, the Webflow CMS ID, is null, we want to run this request. There's another check there around if they're submitting a profile image, but we'll just ignore that. Don't want to complicate things too much. If they don't have an existing item, then we want to make a new item. We want to do a post request, and that's going to create a new one. If they do have an existing item, which would be this one down here, the else, then this works slightly differently. Then we need to update the user's existing item, not create a new one. And the way that works is we need to push the ID, we need to put this ID here, this Webflow CMS ID, into the request. So there's a very handy feature in Xano called sprint F. And what that allows us to do is allows us to put in this £sign with an S, and we can then dynamically replace that each time we run this request. So we put in that little symbol, the percentage sign, and the S, and then we add a filter, a sprint F filter or an S print F filter. And what we do is we get that user's Webflow CMS ID. So this is basically saying to Webflow, hey, I want to go to this collection ID. I then want to go to this specific post, which would be the user's Webflow CMS ID. And I want to update it. I want to do a patch. Post is to create a new item, patch is to update it. So this is basically saying we want to update an item as opposed to creating a new one. So again, very briefly, the logic for that was the first time this runs, there won't be an ID here. So it's going to create a new item and it's going to save that item's ID. The next time that user comes back, it's going to see that they do have a CMS ID and is going to update it as opposed to creating a new one. The last thing we have is we have an input for if the user wants their listing to be live or not. So if input live equals true, there's another API link that Webflow gives us to publish an item. So we're first creating it and then we're either publishing it or unpublishing it, depending on what the user wants. And that, folks, is pretty much it for how this works. There's some other checks here where we have some logic here to handle. If the user uploaded an image, we need to create it into an image. We're doing some conditionals just to check what profile type, if they're a freelancer or an agency. And then the guts of it down here is these API calls to Webflow to send that content over. And that brings us to the end of today's session. So as a very brief recap, we looked at the Webflow API, which allows us to both get and receive content from the Webflow CMS. We first used an API call to get our data from the CMS so that we can see how it's structured. And using that information, we created another API endpoint to send that information to Webflow, at which point it gets added into the CMS. And we also looked at how we can check if we are either creating a new CMS item for a user or if we're updating an existing one. And that way users can fill out a form on the site. The data is saved in Xano and then added to the Webflow CMS, which is better for SEO than if we were dynamically rendering the content straight out of Xano. And just keep in mind that Webflow CMS limit, as that might cause some issues if you do start to hit that. So thank you for watching. As always, please leave a like. If you have any suggestions, questions, or upcoming videos you'd like to see, please leave those in the comments, and we'll see you at the next Finsweet Plus session.